This is the Co-Creators Convergence Thursday Creator Convo. And we have an amazing guest tonight, Sandra Sheridan. She's going to be introduced by her dear friend and colleague, Olivia Cheever. And before we do that, I'm going to show a very short video for those of you who are new to the Co-Creators Convergence, just to tell you a little bit about us. So hold on one moment. I hope you learned a little bit about the Co-Creators Convergence, and we're here tonight. You saw number 5 on that screen said that we have a retreat at White Eagle Lodge, October 13th through 17th, and we are live at the retreat. So we have a room full of guests here, and it's going to be a wonderful evening. And so without any further ado, I want to turn it over to Olivia Cheever, who will bring us into a centering, and then we'll introduce our guests. And she has a lot to show us and share with us, and incredible. We're going to get an inside look at the United Nations, and I'm not going to tell you anymore. You got to stay tuned. So hold on, and Olivia, over to you. Thank you, dear friend, for bringing wonderful Sandy Sheridan.
It's a pleasure. Let's all become present to the space that you're in right now, and just tune into your breath and shift to a more dignified, upright posture. If you're sitting or standing, your feet are on the floor. And begin to notice your inhalation, and notice it spiraling up your back, all the way up to the top of your head. And then spiraling down the front of your body, all the way down to the ground at your feet, Mother Earth. And then inhaling up, uplifting. And exhaling down. Spiraling down into the earth, forming a root at our feet. And then thinking of something that makes you smile, or someone that makes you smile. Reaching out into all 4 corners of the room, expanding your personal bubble out into the space, including everyone and everything in your personal space. And inviting the quality of peace, the vibration, the frequency, the resonance. And ask yourself, what would it be like if I had a little more peace in my being right now? And notice your body's response. Nice. And again, just inhaling up your back, all the way up to the sky. And exhaling down your front. And inviting everyone into your personal space, including everyone on this call, all over, and smiling. And coming present. Thank you, or wado, as we say in Cherokee. I want to thank Noel and Bob, and good evening, everyone. I have a particular pleasure in introducing my friend and colleague, Sandra Sheridan, to lead tonight's conversation. She's going to tell us about Sunray's role with Indigenous peoples in the international community. I'm particularly excited about this, not only because she is a friend and a colleague and a teacher of our Sunray's global peacekeeper training, but also because she is our Sunray UN NGO representative. I grew up with the UN when my father was involved with the founding of the United Nations, when he worked with the State Department after serving in the Navy during World War II. He became a professor of international law, and with his best friend from Harvard, who also served in the Navy and taught international law, wrote one of the first textbooks on the founding of the United Nations. It was entitled Organizing for Peace, International Organization in World Affairs by Daniel S. Cheever and H. Field Haviland, and it was published in 1954 by Houghton Mifflin. They published this textbook only 9 years after the founding of the UN in 1945 at the end of the war. And in their book, Dad and Field emphasized that both governmental organizations, but also non-governmental organizations had important roles to play in world peace. When I met Venerable Dehani Wahu, she was in the process of establishing the Sunray Meditation Society and Peace Village Land Trust, a spiritual society dedicated to world peace and reconciliation. Venerable Dehani had been involved with other Indigenous wisdom keepers in bringing to the attention of the UN that to truly be a global organization for peace, it needed to represent the rights of all Indigenous people. Because of this, Sunray was recognized as an NGO in 1992. When Sandy saw the need to support and continue the work Venerable Dehani had started, Sandy stepped up as our Sunray NGO representative 20 years ago. I can't wait to hear some of her stories tonight, as I'm sure all of you are too. I know that my father and his dear friend Field Haviland are looking down on Sandy tonight and smiling as she enlightens us about the fabulous work that NGOs like Sunray are accomplishing together to weave a basket of peace. We are all in this together. Please join me in welcoming my friend and Sunray NGO representative, Sandra Sheridan.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Thank you. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you, Noel. Thank you, Bob. Thank you for the co-creators, Convergence, for all of you who are here today. It's really an honor to be here. And I'm grateful that we are all here together in this circle tonight. And I'll be sharing about Sunray Meditation Society, about Indigenous peoples, and the international community. As Olivia said, I'm the Sunray UN United Nations NGO representative, and I have been for 20-some years. The first thing I like to do is to acknowledge the land that I'm on, that people are on. So I would like to say that I am speaking today from Lenape land, specifically Tappan Lenape land. And if I look out the window, in the daytime anyway, I see the Mohicanatuck River. And it's a river that flows both ways. It's also known as the Hudson River. So I'm located northwest of New York City or Manhattan. So my intention tonight is to share with you information and experiences about what I've been doing with Sunray as an NGO with the United Nations, and specifically with Indigenous people, because that's what our focus is. And one of the things that I've learned being around Native teachings is the different views. So we look at things from a personal view, from the family, from the community, or the state, the nation, the planet, and the universe. So you can look at all those different levels. So tonight I'm going to be talking about that planetary view, that international view. That's what I'm talking about. And just to tell you a little bit about my upbringing, I grew up in the mountains of North Carolina, Western North Carolina, in the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Great Smoky Mountains, and one of the oldest mountain ranges in the world, 400 million years old, actually. And the county that I grew up in, where my family lives, still lives now, is called the Land of the Waterfalls, because there's 250 waterfalls just in that county itself. So I've come from very ancient land, ancient beautiful land. And then I moved to New York City. So after college, I had a degree in dance and I moved to New York City. I had a career in modern dance in New York City. Then I went on to learn some movement training, then into the fitness world, and then into physical therapy. When I was in my 40s, I went back to school and got a master's degree in physical therapy. So I've been doing physical therapy work now for 20 some years, and specifically manual therapies. It's cranial sacral therapy, you may know of, and visceral manipulation. So it's all hands-on work, and it's a little bit different systems than regular physical therapy. As I was dancing in modern dance and exploring, I began to, of course, search out different spiritual traditions, different religions, as I'm sure all of you have done. And I heard about a workshop in Rhode Island where there are 3 female spiritual teachers, and Venerable Dahani Wahu was one of them. And as soon as I heard her teaching, you know, what she was saying, and then heard the songs and the chants, it was like, oh, you know, this makes sense to me. I understand this. This makes sense. It's like being home, coming home. And I'm sure you all have experienced that in your own ways and in different traditions also. So from there, I started studying with Sunray Meditation Society after several years when I was able to do that. So it's because of that that I've gotten involved with the international community through Sunray NGO. So Sunray is an international spiritual organization dedicated to planetary peace. Its purpose is to manifest the Native American concept of circle mind, or the thought that all beings are relatives in the field of life, and to manifest the idea of caretaker mind, that we may create a world of beauty upon the earth and throughout the family of life. And our mission is to preserve and share the teachings of the Wahu lineage of the Tsalagi or the Cherokee traditions, of the peacemaker, and teachings of the peacekeeping from Tibetan Buddhism. So we have 2 streams there. Venerable Dahani Wahu is the founder and spiritual director of Sunray Meditation Society. She's the 27th lineage holder of the Wahu lineage of this tradition. And she's been entrusted by her elders, by her family, by her ancestors. She has been entrusted to maintain the teachings of the Wahu lineage, which are to ensure methods of stabilizing the mind in terms of confusion, times of confusion. She's also a recognized Dharma teacher, Tibetan Buddhist Dharma teacher, with acknowledgement and recognition both from the Nyingmapa school and also from the Drikung Kagyu schools. So you can see in Sunray, we're weaving together different strands, different traditions, different streams are coming together. Sunray has year-round programs for spiritual development, service, skillful methods to practice compassion and right relationship with the earth and and all beings. And participation is open to people of all walks of life, any tradition, any way of being that you prefer, as long as you're of good heart. So the beginning level training of Sunray is the Peacekeeper Training Program, where we learn a basic meditation practice, which consists of a dance called the Dance of the Directions. And then we have a sitting practice, which is sitting, visualization and chanting also. So through these practices, we delve into exploring ourselves, our thoughts, but not just our thoughts, but our thoughts, our actions, our motivations, our ingrained patterns, and we weed out what is no longer needed. You know, clearing out all that unnecessary clutter that we have in our minds, in our actions, in those patterns. So we're really weaving our life into a basket of balance. The main center is in Vermont, in the Green Mountains of Vermont. It's the Sunray Peace Village. It's a place of transformation, a sanctuary, and it's based upon the Tsalagi or the Cherokee peace villages of many, many years ago, and where the ceremonial cycles are observed. So I thank Venerable Dahani-Wahu and her ancestors, and I also thank our ancestors, my ancestors, your ancestors, all the ancestors, for clearing a path for all of us to be here now, sharing together. And one thing that's important is cultural appropriation. It's important to recognize that at Sunray, we're not inviting people to become Indians, so to speak, but we're inviting people to explore and discover their own inner wisdom and their own inner light within, and to recognize it and acknowledge it in other people. So we're careful about cultural appropriation, which is that unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption of customs, practices, ideas, etc., of one people's or society by members of another, which is typically a more dominant people or society. Cultural appropriation, like racism, can be deeply ingrained in people's minds, as you all know. And in our basic meditation practices, we explore deeply within ourselves the thoughts and actions of separation and discrimination. Back in the 1990s, when I was asked to take on the responsibilities of Sunray Meditation Society, we were involved with the NGO Committee on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And because of this incredible wealth of knowledge, the wisdom, the compassion that I had experienced through Sunray and with Native American elders, my life has been transformed. And I find that I must do what I can to help make things better for Indigenous peoples and to educate people about their issues and concerns. So who are Indigenous peoples? Well, it's estimated there are between 370 to 500 million Indigenous people around the world, spread across 90 countries, accounting for about 6.2% of the global population. From the Arctic down to the South Pacific, they are the descendants, according to a common definition, of those who inhabited a country or a geographical region at the time when people of different cultures or ethnic origins arrived. The new arrivals later became dominant through conquest, occupation, settlement, or other means. Among the Indigenous peoples are those of the Americas, Turtle Island, like the Lakota, the Cherokee, the Diné, the Hopi. There's lots of them in the United States. The Maya in Guatemala, the Mapuche in Chile, the Sami of Northern Europe, and the Inuit and the Aleutians of the circumpolar region, the Aborigines and the Torres Strait Islanders of Australia, the Maori of New Zealand, Aotearoa. These and most other Indigenous peoples have retained their there's distinct characteristics which are clearly different from those of other segments of the national populations. Indigenous people are holders of incredible knowledge and information, particularly about the lands and being with the lands and with the elements. They have a special relationship with language and knowledge systems. Their language is their culture. Their language is their culture. On a more local level, so we are there globally thinking, now coming down to the United States, which I think most of you are right now. There are 6.79 million Native Americans in the United States, and there are 574 federally recognized tribes or nations. And there's about 64 state recognized tribes. And then there are a lot of tribes, nations, bands that are not recognized by the governments. And that's various reasons why they're not recognized. I mean, I know of some tribes that have been trying for 30, 40 longer years to become recognized, federally recognized or even state recognized. But there's also some groups, some bands, some tribes who say, well, you know, why should we want to be recognized by a government who has been destroying our culture? It has in the past, and it continues to still be today. There are 14 states with more than 100,000 American Indian or Alaska Native residents. California, Oklahoma, Arizona, Texas. Some of you are in Texas right now. New Mexico, Washington, New York, where I am, North Carolina, Florida, Alaska, Michigan, Oregon, Colorado, and Minnesota. Now, getting down to a more local level, Texas, since I know you're in Texas, some of you, there are 3 federally recognized tribes: the Alabama Coshada tribe of Texas, the Yslita del Sur Pueblo, and the Kickapoo traditional tribe of Texas. The 3 federally recognized in the state of Texas. The Lipan Apache tribe of Texas is recognized, and there are at least 24 other communities with historic ties to Texas. The name Texas itself comes from a Caddo Indian word, which means friends or allies. Culture and knowledge. Indigenous people are the holders of unique cultures, knowledge systems, and beliefs, and possess invaluable knowledge of practices for the sustainable management of natural resources. They have a special relationship to and use of their traditional lands. Their ancestral land has a fundamental importance for their collective physical and cultural survival as peoples. They speak an overwhelming majority of the world's estimated 7,000 languages and represent 5,000 different cultures. Political participation. Indigenous people often have much in common with other neglected segments of society, like lack of political representation and participation, economic marginalization and poverty, lack of access to social services and basic human rights, discrimination. Despite their cultural differences, the diverse Indigenous peoples share common problems, also related to their rights. They strive for recognition of their identities, their ways of life, and their right to traditional lands, territories, and natural resources. Although numerous indigenous people worldwide are self-governing, and some have been successful in establishing autonomy in various forms, many indigenous people still come under the ultimate authority of central governments, who exercise control over their lands, territories, and resources. Despite that reality, indigenous peoples have demonstrated extraordinary examples of good governance, ranging from the Haudenosaunee in the United States or the Iroquois Confederacy or the Six Nations, to the existing Sami parliaments in Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and also the Inuit Circumpolar Council. So now about the United Nations, just very briefly. As you know, the United Nations is predominantly the governments of the countries who are all members of the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the Trusteeship Council, the Secretariat. There are 193 countries that make up the General Assembly. The United Nations, and I quote, works to maintain international peace and security, give humanitarian assistance to those in need, protect human rights, and uphold international law. The focus of the United Nations right now is on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It's a blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet, now and obviously in the future. And at its heart are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. This is an urgent call for countries, for action by all countries, developed and developing countries in a global partnership. They recognize that ending poverty and other deprivations must go hand in hand with strategies that improve health and education, reduce inequality, spur economic growth, as well as tackling climate change. Now, civil society. The United Nations is the governments, and NGOs or non-governmental organizations are civil society or CSOs. CSOs are NGOs. The term is often used together. As we said, Sunray Meditation Society is an NGO in association with the United Nations, specifically with the Department of Global Communications. Now, NGOs perform a variety of services and humanitarian functions. They bring citizens' concerns to governments, monitor policies, and encourage political participation at the community level. NGOs and CSOs provide analysis and expertise, serve as early warning mechanisms, and help monitor and implement international agreements, including Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. So within the United Nations and the international community are the NGOs. The world we want. So you see that we at Sunray and the United Nations, and I'm sure all of you, envision, dream, and look to a world of balance, a world of universal sustainable peace. Sometimes, well, at the UN, sometimes it's referred to as the world we want. And this can be seen in a video. It's a short clip. It's a 2-minute clip that the United Nations put together for their 75th anniversary of the UN, which was a few years ago. And it's 75 photos coming from more than 50,000 images from over 130 countries in response to the Secretary General's call to hear directly from the peoples of the world about their priorities for the future. So if we could see that first video about the world we want from the United Nations. Thank you.
I want a world without
the world we want.
I want a world filled with smiles and laughter, where everybody spreads love instead of hate.
I want a world where all people take care of our planet. I want a world without pollution.
I want a world where our children can go anywhere safely and freely.
I want a world where our unique differences won't separate us, but rather unite us in love.
A world that brings justice to those who treat anybody as anything other than equal.
I want a world without borders, physically and mentally, where all people are treated equally, no matter what.
I want a world of liberation, a world where we can breathe without borders of identity, gender, or race. A world where we are free, spoken, heard, and equal. A world where we can all belong.
Thank you. Thank you, wonderful tech. I think we can all agree with that. Now, Sunray is an NGO. The goals of Sunray as an NGO are centered on raising awareness of Indigenous peoples' issues of land rights, mineral rights, water, poverty, health, basic human rights, preservation of culture. We strive to provide places where their voices can be heard, especially on an international level. With those voices, we're planting seeds of peace, seeds of right relationship. We need those voices. We need Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities for a better world. It's also important for me to say that Sunray NGO, we take our directives and our cues from Indigenous peoples. We don't go into a situation and say, well, I think you should do this, or I think you should do that. I sit back and I listen, and I work to support what Indigenous people want to do and how they want to do it. As I said earlier, I'm involved with the NGO Committee on the Rights of Indigenous People. And this committee is made up of other representatives of other NGOs. Now, it's made up of religious organizations, some Indigenous organizations, universities, so we have academia there, and then other civil society organizations. So it's people from all over the world and all different ways of relating to Indigenous people that get together and work to, again, bring more Indigenous voices out into the international world or community, especially at the United Nations, such as events like the Commission on the Status of Women, or social development, or the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which I'll talk more about later. Each member of the Indigenous Committee is a representative for their NGO. So if they're a representative of a large NGO, as some of them are, they can share with their members around the world, because most of them have offices around the world. Now, the mission of the committee, the NGO Committee on the Rights of Indigenous People, is to promote respect for and the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and other UN mechanisms. There's what's called the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous People, and also a Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People. So these are all mechanisms within the UN system where Indigenous peoples can be represented. And also the committee is to assist whenever possible in the education of the international community about concerns and issues facing people. One of the main events that we're involved with, both Sunray and the Indigenous Committee, is the International Day of the World's Indigenous People, which is every August 9th, and it's been around since about 1992, I think. It's a day of celebration of Indigenous people's culture, Indigenous people, and our committee has been helping with this for a while at the celebration at UN headquarters in New York. So I want to show you another video. Actually, there's two videos about the International Day. The first one is 3.5 minutes. Oh, sorry. The first one is 1 minute and 14 seconds, and the next one is about 3 minutes. So this will really give you an idea of what the International Day is about. Thank you. Thank you. And the next one.
The International Day for the World's Indigenous Peoples. It's celebrated on 9th August every year. But why do we observe this day? Is indigenous culture really that important that we have to celebrate it with a special day? Are they more important than mainstream ethnic groups? Well, let's put that into perspective. There are around 370 million indigenous people worldwide, representing only around 5% of the global population. Yet they account for 5,000 distinct cultures and speak an overwhelming majority of the world's 7,000 known languages. This means that indigenous peoples, they hold most of the world's cultural diversity, even though they constitute just a fraction of its population. And that diversity, it brings with it priceless knowledge. There's knowledge about our ancestry, about our environment and our place in it, even about our belief systems and our social structures. And this knowledge, it's often hyper-local. It's winnowed through generations and specific to a particular place and to a particular people.
Living on the piece of land that we have managed for thousands of years, we have developed and accumulated a vast range of body of knowledge. And this knowledge, we have applied it, whether it's in our traditional institutions, governance systems, in our ways of resource management, cultural expression, science, etc., etc. I see today that we also can present a lot of solutions to the problems that the world is facing.
So preserving this kind of knowledge and drawing lessons from them, it could be invaluable to charting a better future for humankind as a species.
So we are knowledge holders, and we want to also contribute, and we do not want to lose this.
But though invaluable, indigenous people, they account for a third of the world's extremely poor rural population. And with far less political representation and mainstream ethnic groups, they are vulnerable to exploitation, especially when it comes to their land. Globalization also means that ideas and systems and languages of mainstream society, they're spreading faster and wider, diluting the culture of indigenous peoples who are very often under pressure to assimilate. That's a lot of diversity, a lot of knowledge, under serious threat. So why do we observe this day? For indigenous peoples, it's a chance to celebrate their own cultures and be proud of their place in modern society. For mainstream society, it's a chance to understand the challenges that these communities continue to face, especially when it comes to land rights and access to education. But more than that, it's a chance to appreciate just how much we can learn from them.
Things have been on Zoom, as you know, and that includes some of the United Nations events. So the International Day of the World's Indigenous People has been on, well, it's been on UN Web TV. You can actually see a lot of what's going on at the United Nations through the UN Web TV, and the International Day was on that. So people, the general public could view it that way. So if you're interested in seeing other things, you may be able to do it through that system. Now, so the International Day is one event or that we've been involved with. The other one is the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And this is a 2-week event every year. It's been about 20 years now, and it's usually in the spring. And this is the time when Indigenous people from all over the world come to UN headquarters in New York, and they have time to share their issues. They only have a short amount of time, but it's a time when Indigenous people are there, governments are there, UN agencies are there. So it's really a time for people to be heard on an international level. And what I'd like to do now is I would like to share my screen and show you a few pictures about this. I believe I'm going to try, yeah, about this Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues at the UN headquarters in New York. Okay, as you know, this is the UN headquarters in New York on the East River, sorry. Which actually I just learned the East River is not really a river, it's a tribal estuary. And this is a picture. It's very hard to find a map of Indigenous people, a global map, because there's so many of them everywhere. But this was one that I just wanted to show you because you can see, you get an idea. You get an idea, somewhat of an idea anyway. This is the General Assembly Hall. This is where the governments, 193 governments, get together and make policies. This is, we usually have the opening of the Permanent Forum, usually gets to be in the General Assembly Hall also. This is Autumn Altir. She's a teenager. She's a young woman from Ontario, and I will not pronounce the First Nation name because I'll probably do it wrong, but you can see it up there. And she's quite amazing because she, like at 16 years old, she was named the Water Commissioner for the nation, this particular nation, and she's spoken before the United Nations numerous times, and she's really wonderful, really wonderful. to see an Indigenous young person speaking. This is again at the United Nations at the opening of the permanent forum in the General Assembly Hall. And this is Tatadeo. He is the chief of the Onondaga Nation. The Onondaga is a part of the Haudenosaunee from upstate New York and some of Canada. And they always open the sessions of the permanent forum. So they speak in their language and have a special blessing where they open the meetings, the 2-week meeting anyway, and others. This is a picture, just a picture of different Indigenous people attending the permanent forum on Indigenous issues. So it gives you an idea of the different peoples and all that wonderful knowledge and information that they share and they're sharing together. One of the things that I really noticed about being around the permanent forum for so long is Indigenous people coming to New York is very tough. I mean, it's expensive. It's quite a different world for them. The first chair of the permanent forum was a reindeer herder, a Sami from Norway area, I think. So you can imagine what kind of a world it must be to go from reindeer herding to being in the middle of New York City. There's a lot of Indigenous people who are not able to get visas to come into this country to be able to attend this. But what I was getting to saying is that from my experience, for Indigenous people from different nations to be able to get together and talk to each other is one of the most remarkable things about the permanent forum in an informal way, because they share with each other what their problems are, what their situations are, what's happening, what isn't happening, what's working for them, what isn't working for them. So a lot of relationships have developed just from this kind of informality of being together at the permanent forum, besides, of course, all the more formal reports and everything that goes out from the United Nations. And just another picture. I thought this was a wonderful picture because it's about Indigenous women. And you can see they're there at the UN and they're working together. They're probably working on putting together a statement, a joint statement to present, because you only have like 3 or 5 minutes for each group or person or nation to present. This is another picture of some Sami people. I think this one woman is Kailash, I believe. I'm not sure. I think so, from the Afghanistan area. This is Roberto Borrero. He is the chair of the NGO Committee on the Rights of Indigenous People. He is Taino from Borocan, also known as Puerto Rico. This is a flyer of a side event that Sunray helped put together. And I just wanted to show this to you because these speakers, this was about mental health, Indigenous healing of mental health, Indigenous ways of mental health. And all these speakers here are Indigenous people. So they really live in 2 worlds. They live in 2 worlds. And this woman is from Nagaland in India. Okay, I'm going to stop this and stop sharing. Now, we're going to go to the last video, number 4. It's the one about the permanent forum on Indigenous issues. If we could have that video, the 4th video, please. And that'll be the last one, Noel.
They were always here, the original inhabitants, the custodians of our planet. They have lived on their ancestral lands in harmony with nature for centuries. Their cultures are rich and diverse. They speak the majority of the world's languages. They are the guardians of some of the Earth's most precious resources and some of the most desired ones. The world's 370 million indigenous people are among the most vulnerable and disadvantaged populations in the world. They are facing increasing pressures to exploit their ancestral lands. The United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues gives them a voice, an international platform to share their challenges and find solutions.
2030 Agenda has given the Indigenous peoples a certain level of expectation and of hope that in this one, when they are going forward towards 2030, there will be some recognition and that it will be incorporated, their priorities, their concerns, their rights.
This year's forum will discuss the Indigenous peoples' collective rights to lands, territories, and resources, and other threats facing the indigenous communities today.
And we hope that the end result will have positive impact to those communities who have been agitating when you talk about issues on land. And we hope even the recommendation can reach to the relevant government. And we also hope at the same time those recommendations can effectively implemented within the country and also disseminated to the community that they're affected.
I think, like with all other important international instruments and documents, the beauty and the power of all these is in the implementation. These are all like a roadmap. This is what the world has agreed it will do, and this, in this way, for the indigenous peoples, as with everybody else, I believe, everybody has a responsibility. As indigenous peoples always say, we are not the problem. We want to be part of the solution. We're not against development. We want to be part of development, but development on our terms.
The 2030 Agenda promises to leave no one behind. That promise includes the indigenous peoples. By protecting the rights of its custodians, we protect the future of our planet.
Thank you. Okay, that's the last of the videos. We need Indigenous communities for a better world. Being on the Indigenous Committee, I find that it's really a family now, it's really a community, and people of like mind hoping to improve, and we're really working to improve situations. We're all weaving together a basket of harmony and relationship. But being in this work is challenging. It's not easy. It's difficult. You hear about situations that are happening around the world that you wouldn't necessarily hear about because the media in this country doesn't report it. But I just want to say a little bit about some of the heartbreaks that we hear about is the Indigenous brothers and sisters who are being killed, who were and are being murdered by just defending their lands. They're just trying to defend their lands. The continuing destruction and disrespect of the lands, particularly with the extractive industries, with mining, big problem. Their language, culture, basic human rights. We all know about the missing and murdered Indigenous women in the United States and Canada, and probably throughout the whole world. And the children who were forced into the residential schools, and on and on. And also there's a lot of joy when we hear things like when the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was finally passed in 2007. Now, it was passed by the General Assembly in 2007. And this declaration took about 20 some years to get to this point where it was voted on by the General Assembly. And of course, a lot of people will say, well, why did it take so long? You know, da, da, da. But if you think about it, it's 193 countries that have to look at this and vote on this. So there's a lot of work and time that goes into a international document like this. Very happy when one of the first things that happened after the declaration was passed was a land rights case in Belize where the declaration was used and supported so the people were able to get their land back in Belize. Also happiness when a country finally recognizes their indigenous people. Some countries say they don't have indigenous people, but we know they do. I was very happy when I read this that Japan, just in 2019, recognized the Ainu people, they were recognized by the governments. And happiness when indigenous leaders gain seats in national, state, or local governments, all leading to indigenous voices being heard. For example, in Canada, the Inuk leader, Mary Simon, has been chosen as the next Governor General of Canada, the first indigenous person to be appointed to this role. And of course, in this country, Deb Haaland, as the Secretary of Interior, again, the first indigenous person to be appointed to this role. We're glad when countries are taken to task about their treatment of indigenous nations and indigenous peoples. We're glad when we see children relearning their languages, their songs, their culture, their games, their sports. And there's a real resurgence of this now, of children relearning their language, not just children, but relearning their indigenous languages and playing their sports. So that's really wonderful to see. And also very happy when we see the rise and the power of indigenous youth speaking out for their rights through music, through song, dance, literature, and language, which you see of. And also very happy to see that more states and cities are recognizing Indigenous Peoples Day in October, which we've seen just happen this year. Now, some examples of Native American weaving a basket of peace, some particularly powerful examples of this is, as I've been talking about, the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederacy. There's you may know this already, there's the Great Law of Peace. This is a constitution that established a democracy between 5 Iroquois tribes, the Seneca, Cayuga, Oneida, Onondaga, and Mohawk. And this Iroquois, the Confederacy, the Iroquois Confederacy, was founded by the great peacemaker. And the Iroquois claim that this event dates back to the late 12th century, but Western scholars suggest the date is about 1451. It's the oldest living participatory democracy on Earth. This Great Law of Peace was written on wampum belts. It was conceived by Dekanawida, known as the Great Peacemaker, and his spokesman, Hiawatha. The original 5 members ratified the Constitution, and then the 6th nation, the Tuscarora, was added in 1722. Now, this Constitution influenced the United States Constitution. In 1988, the US Senate paid tribute with a resolution that said, the Confederation of the original 13 colonies into one republic was influenced by the political system developed by the Iroquois Confederacy, as were many of the democratic principles which were incorporated into the Constitution itself. The Iroquois Confederacy, or the Haudenosaunee, have a Thanksgiving address. There's, of course, a Mohawk word, or Haudenosaunee, I think it's a Mohawk term, but I will not read that because I know that I don't know how to pronounce it. Okay, it's their central prayer and invocation. It reflects their relationship of giving thanks for life and the world around them. The Haudenosaunee open and close every social and religious meeting with a Thanksgiving address. It acknowledges the people, the earth, the waters, the plants, the animals, the birds, the bushes, the trees, the winds, the sun, the moon, the stars, as well as unseen spiritual forces. There are a multitude of connections between human beings and other living beings in the world. It's also said as a daily sunrise prayer. The children learn that according to Native American tradition, people everywhere are embraced as family. Our diversity, like all wonders of nature, is truly a gift for which we are thankful. The address is based on the belief that the world cannot be taken for granted, that a spiritual communication, thankfulness, and acknowledgement of all living things must be given to align the minds and hearts of the people with nature. Now, the Algonquin. From the Algonquin, we have the way of the Heron. The way of the Heron isn't merely about conflict resolution and mediation. It's also about getting to a higher level of understanding about yourself and the people around you. And I learned about this from a teacher, an Algonquin elder, Evan Pritchard, and he's written a book on the way of the Heron and teaches about it, which is really wonderful. He's written a lot of books, which are quite fascinating. But also, I want to share a little story. Another Algonquin elder, Grandfather Mike Bestine, who's a wonderful, wonderful speaker. And if you ever get a chance to hear him, I highly recommend that you do. I heard him speak recently, and he was talking about learning the peace building and peacekeeping and mediation skills from nature. And he commented on, you know, if you see a robin on a tree limb or a telephone pole or whatever, and then a cardinal might fly nearby, and they're just singing their songs. They're just singing away. Now, you don't see the robin saying to the cardinal, like, you know, what are you singing? What kind of a song is that? That doesn't make sense. That's not the right song. You should be singing my song. Or things like, you know, your colors, you know, that's just too loud. You know, you really should get some different colors. You don't see that. That just doesn't happen in nature like that. And the cardinal's not going to say to the robin, well, your song, well, I don't like your song. You know, your song is just, you know, what is that? You know, that doesn't make any sense. And you're so dull with your gray or whatever. You know, you're not going to see that in nature. So it was a wonderful example of listening and observing nature and learning from nature, really learning from nature. So what I've been sharing with you is about what we've been doing to weave a basket of peace together, which all of you are doing in your own ways. I want to finish with reading something from Venerable Dahani Wahu, from her book, Voices of Our Ancestors. Whatever your religion or philosophical views, we may each trace our roots to the great tree of peace, the tree of life. Whatever we call ourselves, the result is the same. We are people living together on planet Earth. The earth is alive and she sings, calling us to remember our sacred place and our dance in life. May we honor the wisdom of our grandparents and caretake that wisdom for our grandchildren unto 7 generations. Let us recognize the sacredness of this time of transformation and choice, that we may truly manifest the beauty as family of humanity. So I thank you very much for being here, for listening to me. I hope this has provided some insight, some education, and maybe some inspiration, so that we can all plant seeds of good cause, seeds of right relationship, and seeds of peace. So now I would open it up for questions, comments, anything people would like to say or ask, or share about how they're weaving their basket of peace.
Go ahead, Pamela.
I would just like to say that I appreciate the becoming so much more aware of the enormity of the challenge. And I honestly had no idea. So thank you, Sandra. And, you know, I've always felt very deeply, being an empath, for indigenous cultures, but I was not aware of the extent, and I am so thankful that efforts like this are underway. And I did have a question about efforts to make sure that the languages are recorded and the traditions are documented in some way, and that they are continually honored so that they're not lost. That would be horribly tragic.
Thank you so much, Pamela. Thank you. There's different ways to go about preserving the languages. And there's different, I mean, I know, like down in Western North Carolina where my family is, it's Cherokee land, there's reservation there. And I know that they've brought back they're teaching Cherokee in different ways. And I know the Lakota, I know some Lakota people are doing the same thing. I know some Mohawk people are doing the same thing. So I know that within certain areas that's working, you know, that is being brought back. I mean, I don't know about the whole planet, but the other thing is, it's nice you brought that up, because I didn't mention it and I should have, is that there is, starting at next year, 2022, there's going to be an international decade on Indigenous languages. So the UN is going to be focusing on Indigenous languages, and I think UNESCO is working with that mostly. But you know, that's really important, because language, I mean, it's their culture. You know, language is not like just speaking. It's like it is what you are to them. Thank you.
So I so appreciate your hearing about the connection to the UN and the work that the UN does. And, you know, we are living in the time of prophecy of the 7th generation rising that Crazy Horse talked about, the Rainbow Warriors that the Hopi talk about. And I know that when young Native Americans testify at the UN, or Greta testifies, they get very frustrated by the snail's pace and wondering how change is going to happen enough to meet the moment that we're in. So given you all's vast experience with the UN, I just wondered if you could speak to that, because I know Greta, you know, well enough to know that she's so frustrated because she feels like she speaks and speaks to all the right people, and yet not much is happening. So, you know, if you had words of wisdom for her, or these young activists that are trying to push all the right buttons, what would that be? Is there another strategy they could adopt, or what are your thoughts about what you'd advise them?
Thank you. Yeah, the United Nations, it's a system. It works slowly. It isn't a place that you go and something happens quickly. And I think a lot of people, young people or not young people, you know, you go there and you think, oh, you're speaking before the United Nations. Well, yes, but that their system, things are not going to happen right away. So that's why it's good, you know, if you have a particular issue that you're working on, is you got to work on all these different levels. So not just, you know, not just the international, but national and local levels. So, you know, you got to cover all the bases, so to speak. Sometimes with the UN, you know, things will get through. But again, because the UN is the governments of the countries, so you're really, you know, when you're speaking to the UN, even at the permanent forum, you're speaking to Indigenous people, but it's through the UN system, so it's through the governments of the countries. So it's not something that's going to happen right away. So I would, you know, my suggestion is try other systems. You know, all systems working together is what I'm trying to say. What I tell people sometimes, you know, because it seems slow, but the UN, or the work that I've been doing at the UN, is I feel like I'm a long distance runner, because I'm, you know, working to provide a basis or a foundation to have Indigenous voices in the UN system. It's not like I could help solve a local Native American problem through the UN, because you have to go through the governments, which then goes through so and so and so and so. So, you know, I'm sorry I can't answer more hopefully or more specifically, but that's what I found. It's not like it goes to a policy level, so it will affect for generations to come. So that's what I see as important about the UN. It won't necessarily affect right away, although in some cases it might, but it's a policy level. So, you know, we got the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So this is a declaration that is used and will be used for, I don't know how long, for Indigenous rights. So it's more of a foundation level.
Right. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Olivia?
Yes, I wanted to say that, Noel, I know you have your hand raised. Do you mind if I just say something before we go on?
No, that's fine. I was actually raising it for Annie, who would like to speak.
Oh, great.
So, you go ahead, and then Annie.
I'm just going to call attention to how important this is to bring people together, to communicate together. There's a book called Multi-Track Diplomacy by Sunray's own Dr. Louise Diamond, who was a very well-respected peace builder who influenced Hillary Clinton, among others. And she and her colleague, Ambassador John McDonald, I put it in the chat. But what was so amazing was they brought together all these different tracks. Louise also worked very closely with Indigenous people and very much believed in the interconnectedness of all being. And what they did was they made a think tank in Washington, and they brought people together from all different places. And this was very unusual, because mostly people are very siloed, as they say. They're very divided usually and separate, and they don't talk together. So Sandy, I think this is so amazing what the UN is doing by having these indigenous people come together and talk with each other, and also talk with the organizations that are governmental organizations, that the NGOs are communicating. This is huge. And I remember when I was just meeting Venerable Dhani, I'm a historian in my background, among other things. And what happened was I was studying the prophecies, and the early prophecies actually prophesied that the wisdom keepers would come to the world order. They called it the glass house or something. And they were foreseeing coming to the United Nations, and that they would come 4 times. And if they did not get heard by the 4th time, they would go away and the earth would fall into really deep trouble. And luckily, I think it was People of the Earth, one of the organizations, gave them their time, gave the indigenous wisdom keepers their time so that they could be heard. And my teacher and Sandy's teacher, Venerable Dhani Wahu, was one of the 5th generation that went out and went all over the world, but also to the United Nations, saying, if you are going to be a global center for peace, and you are standing as a moral authority, United States, for people's rights, then why did you take away the spiritual sovereignty of your indigenous people in the 1800s? And by gum, in 1978, when Jimmy Carter was president, they restored the rights of sovereignty to the indigenous people. But the United States had to do that because they were holding themselves up as moral authorities after World War II with the Holocaust and everything else. And the indigenous people said, wait a minute here, what about glass houses, So I just wanted to say that. And Sandy, you are carrying on the work of the prophecy. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. And please, Annie, do go ahead. Thank you, Noelle. I just wanted to say that I wrote it in the chat. So you have the book there.
Thank you, Olivia.
That's great, Olivia. That's actually a real lead in to what I wanted to say. Sandy, thank you so much for your work. It is absolutely crucial to the future of the planet. I was just thinking about Reconciliation Forum, and that, that's something that would be a very local thing in some sense, each country and each people. Will that ever happen worldwide? But it's absolutely critical. It is absolutely critical to planetary health to have that recognition that Olivia was just speaking of, and that atonement to some degree. And so I'm just realizing that the UN Forum really gives probably the best opportunity that we have for that to happen in kind of a scale level. I had a couple of things I wanted to invite you to speak about if you cared to. The 2 things were, one is that there's a lot of appropriating of native practices. For example, I have a drum that was made by a drum maker who lived with the Kiowa people here in Texas. For a number of years, and he builds drums now. And the children at the Montessori school where I teach actually play this drum every morning, and we do a rattling ceremony to call in brightness of spirit and grounding, and just use some practices like that. And I've heard kind of different things about this not being appropriate to appropriate native practices. So anything you would like to say about that? And then the other thing is actually the Unity Earth community that I met Bob and Noelle through highlighted this. I don't know if it was during it wasn't during World Unity Week, but you spoke about the Iroquois Confederacy And there was a recent reconciliation after many generations that happened. And anything that you wanted to say about that, because I felt like that was a real landmark moment. And especially when we think that that is the foundation of our democracy, once again, we're looking at a core wound, that there was a split in that Confederacy for hundreds of years, and that was recently, I mean, in the last year, restored. And I witnessed part of that ceremony, and I know some people that are here did as well. So anything you'd like to say about either or any of those topics, I'd love to hear it.
Thank you. The thing about appropriation, cultural appropriation, the drum maker, you got this drum from a native person?
He lived with the Kiowa people for 3 to 5 years, I forget, and was taught to do this. And I guess,
Right.
I don't know if he was
Right.
officially commissioned to build drums, but he actually invites you to come in and build a drum with him, or he builds one for you, either way.
Right. So it sounds like he has a good relationship with the Kiowa people that he lived with. So to me, you know, that sounds like it's coming from the heart. And I know that you're coming from the heart. So, and with the children also. So, I mean, this is just a personal thing. That's the way I would look at it. It depends on who said that to you. If another Native person said that to you about cultural appropriation, then I would look at that particular group of Native people and their relationship. Well, there's a lot of things I would look at, but basically, I think if you're coming from the heart and you're aware of not wanting to overdo it with Native American teachings, which I don't think you are, you know, it sounds okay to me. Again, that's a personal thing I'm speaking to you about, you know. Yeah, the reconciliation that you mentioned, I think I know that what you're talking about with the Ramapo, maybe. Really amazing, absolutely phenomenal that this can go on. And I just really hope that more and more of this will be happening, which I think it will, and I think it just needs support from all of us, you know, to do that. You know, Canada has the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has been going on for many, many years. And I've often thought about, well, what about in this country? You know, why don't we have that type of thing? But there's a lot of different views about that. So, but the idea of reconciliation is really important. And I think that we, you know, we can do this too. You know, we can help support this in our own ways on this level.
There's another raised hand, Noel.
Yes, Sheila, go ahead.
Sheila.
Here we go.
Okay. I'm interested to see if you wanted to speak about the foodways of indigenous cultures and the impact on the modern world, or vice versa.
Thank you. That's a huge topic. It's really important, and it makes me think of, I think some of the Mohawk people are really working with foods, their own foods. So I think some of the indigenous people communities, you know, are working in their own ways, beginning more to grow their gardens, which is really important. It's bringing back their culture. And, you know, we all need to eat the food we're supposed to be eating, whatever that is. There's also, there was just an article in the New York Times about an indigenous cookbook. So I think more and more it's indigenous food ways are coming out.
And one more question from Bob.
Masquerading as Annie Spade. Here we go. Is from the global of the UN, let's talk about local for a moment. What would be your single word of advice to those of us who are not indigenous about how we can find, interact with, and support local indigenous where we live?
Yeah, well, the first thing to do is to recognize where you are and what lands you're on. Who were the indigenous people on those lands? Who were here before us? You recognize, you learn, maybe you know already, or maybe you don't know, but it's a little bit of digging maybe to find out whose land was this before you came here or before the Europeans came over here, and then see if there are any of those people around. And you may or may not be able to find that out. But you'd be surprised what you find out if you go exploring, looking for the indigenous people. And sometimes they may not want to show themselves, and that's okay, whatever they choose. But it's really important, I think, for people to recognize the land they're on. Who were the people before? Who were the native people of this land? Because all this land was native land. So it was all somebody else's land before we came here.
Very interesting, because we do that on our email signature. We acknowledge the land we're on and the watershed that we're in. And there was a very interesting article on Indigenous Peoples Day that said that that's a two-sided sword when we non-Indigenous do that. Because if we acknowledge the land on who has stewarded that land in the past as Indigenous, without an acknowledgement of the need for reconciliation,
right,
we're actually creating separation. So it's kind of a counterpoint to what to doing a land acknowledgement, whether it's in your email signature or whether it's the beginning of the event. I just, I seek to know how to. There have been articles about how to support Black people and Black Lives Matter for us white folk, to not lead the parade, not shout, to support them as allies. And I'm seeking that same on how to accomplish that in supporting Indigenous rights, Indigenous culture, without leading the parade.
Right. And I, at the UN, we do a land acknowledgement, and there's a lot of Indigenous people around, so I feel it's okay, so maybe in certain situations it is, but I understand what you're saying also, because yes, there is that whole, and that's what I think this country needs. I think we really need to step up this reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. It really is, it's coming out more and more.
Absolutely. That's really fantastic. Well, I want to turn it over to Olivia just to close. I want to thank you so much. This has been so informative. Get a round of applause here.
I just wanted to mention about next week. I will be hosting a dear friends, Patricia and Dario Campanelli, and their topic is conscious partnership, spiritual nomads, and divine purpose in evolutionary times. Now, Patricia, they're in Hawaii right now, so they're way off our time zone and weren't able to join us. But Patricia is a transformational leadership coach, and I have known her and worked with her for over 20 years. And Dario is from Italy, and he is a self-taught artist, and in classic and now more in abstract. And he won the Spiritual Art Award first place in 2020 for an abstract painting. So he is extremely gifted. And I think the creativity that they will bring to us next week will be really exciting. So I'm looking forward to being with you all next week. Thank you.
Woohoo! Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, Sandra, Olivia, everyone on this